All right, I'm going to ask you, if you would, please, to open your Bibles to the book of Job, Job chapter 32. Job chapter 32. Those of you who attend regularly, or at least a few of you, might remember that 2 out of the last 4 years that I was here, we started our lesson, our Sunday school lesson, in Job chapter 32. So we're going to begin at the same place again this morning that we've been twice before, and then we'll start that as a little bit of a review, and then we'll go on to some new material. Thank you for being here this morning. Let's see, do I have my lapel mic on? Is it on? No? Do I need to turn it on here? Yep, there we go. Okay, now, is it on now? You have me tuned in up there? Okay, good. All right, great. Many of you know that at one time Job was one of the wisest men in the world and one of the wealthiest men in the world. And one day God and Satan were having a conversation about Job. And Satan said to God, in so many words, well, sure, anybody would love you if you treat them as good as you treat Job. Well, God said to Satan, here's what I'll let you do. I'll let you test him in any way you want to, except kill him, and we'll see if he still loves me. And that's not what the lesson's about this morning, but when God did allow Satan to test Job, Job did still love God. But during that testing, Job was suffering. He lost all of his health. He lost all of his wealth. All 10 of his children died in one day's time. And Job had 3 friends who came to visit him because they were going to comfort him during this time of suffering. It turns out they weren't quite as much comfort as we'd wanted them to be, but that was their original purpose for coming. Job and his 3 friends had a big, long conversation that lasted all the way from Job chapter, I think about 2 or 3 is where it starts, and it goes through chapter 31. Now, I don't know if that happened one afternoon under a shade tree or if it was a period of a few days or even a week or two, but this big, long conversation took place. And then in Job chapter 32, for the first time, it's revealed to us that there's actually a 5th person involved in this event that we haven't known up until chapter 32 that he was even there. But he has been there the whole time, and he heard this big, long conversation. His name is Elihu, and we're going to read, starting in Job chapter 32 and verse 1, we're going to read a little bit about Elihu, and we're going to read some of what Elihu said. There's 2 main things that I want you to know about Elihu, because they're going to, those 2 things are going to help us with what we're going to teach today. So when I get to those 2 points, I'll point those out to you. Let's begin in Job chapter 32 with verse 1. So these 3 men, Job's friends, ceased to answer Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. Then was kindled the wrath of Elihu, the son of Barachel the Buzite. Now, if you'll stop right there, that's the first of the 2 things I want you to know about Elihu. I want you to remember that the very first thing God tells us about Elihu is that he's angry. We're going to be reminded of that more than once, but I think it's significant that the very first thing God wanted us to know about Elihu was the fact that he was angry. All right, so let's begin again with verse 1. Verse 2. Then was kindled the wrath, or you could say he was angry, of Elihu, the son of Barachel the Buzite, of the kindred of Ram. Against Job was his wrath kindled, because he justified himself rather than God. Also against his 3 friends was his wrath kindled, because they had found no answer and yet had condemned Job. Verse 4. Now Elihu had waited till Job had spoken, because they were elder than he. So if you look at me again just for a moment, I said there's 2 things about this 5th person in the event named Elihu that I want you to know. The first one was that he was angry. Not just that he was angry, but that's the very first thing God tells us about him, is the fact that he's angry. And then the second thing I want you to know about Elihu is the fact that of the 5 people involved in the event, Elihu is the youngest of the 5. And both of those will help us with what we're going to teach a little bit later. So remember that the first thing God told us about Elihu is that he's angry. And the second thing I want you to remember is he's the youngest person of the 5 people involved. All right, now if you look at verse 5. When Elihu saw that there was no answer in the mouth of these 3 men, then his wrath was kindled. If you notice, that's the 4th time now we've been told that Elihu's angry. So it's not just that the first thing we know about him is that he's angry. I get the impression this kid's out of control. He's lost his temper. God really wants us to know. He told us 4 times that Elihu's angry. All right, now look at verse 6. And Elihu the son of Barachel the Buzite answered and said, I am young, and ye are very old. Wherefore I was afraid, and durst not or dared not show you mine opinion. I said, days should speak, and multitude of years should teach wisdom. So Elihu's admitting here that because he's the youngest person of the 5 people in the story, that he should let those who have lived more days than him speak first. Or those who have lived a multitude of years combined, more than he has, he should let them speak first. So he's admitting that I'm the youngest one, and I knew I should let you guys speak first. And so he did up to this point. Now look at verse 8. This is Elihu still speaking here. But there is a spirit in man, and the inspiration of the Almighty giveth them understanding. Great men are not always wise, neither do the aged understand judgment. Now, if you were here either of the last 2 times we used this reference to begin our lesson, you might remember that I pointed out the fact that you can rarely ever take any one verse in the Bible and pull it out of what we call context, pull it out of where it belongs in the Bible, and look at it all by itself and fully understand what that verse is trying to teach us. Verse 9 is a good example of that, because usually for you to be able to understand what a verse is teaching, you usually have to know who's speaking, and you usually have to know to whom they're speaking. It always helps to know what has been said or what happened just before the verse you're looking at, and it usually helps to know what is said after that. So if you take verse 9 all by itself and look at it over here separate from the rest of the Bible, it almost looks like it's contradicting the rest of the Bible. Because all through the Bible we're taught that the older generation is to teach the younger generation. How many times do we hear Solomon say, my son, give me thine heart. My son, hear your mother's commandments. Even in the New Testament, the Bible says that the aged women are to teach the younger women to be keepers at home and so forth. But Elihu blurts out this statement. Now, the statement he makes is not true. It's true that he made the statement. Now, don't let me confuse you about whether or not the Bible's true. The Bible is true. Every word in the Bible is true. But there's statements in the New Testament that the Pharisees said about Jesus. It's true they made the statement. The statement they made's not true. And this is one of those examples where if you look at it by itself, it sounds like it's contradicting the rest of the Bible. But it's just recording that this young man, the youngest guy in the group, who had lost his temper, blurted out this statement to these older men before he gave his opinion. Now, he's already warned them once that he's going to give his opinion. All right, let's look at verse 10. Verse 9 said, great men are not always wise, neither do the aged understand judgment. That's the criticism that Elihu is making about these older men. But look at verse 10. Therefore I said, hearken to me, I also will show mine opinion. You see what Elihu's doing here is he's trying to criticize their opinion, bring their opinion down a notch or two, because he wants these older men to respect his opinion, even though he's a young man. All right, look at verse 17. This is Elihu still speaking. Elihu says, I said, I will answer also my part. I also will give mine opinion, for I am full of matter. The spirit within me constraineth me. Behold, my belly is as wine which hath no vent. It is ready to burst like new bottles. And again, you might remember that when I was here before, I pointed out the fact that when he uses the word bottle, they didn't have plastic bottles like we have today. They had leather bottles. And somehow they could stitch that leather together in such a way that it would hold liquid, and they would put that new wine, or we would call it grape juice, in that leather bottle. And when that grape juice began to ferment and create the gas, the bubbles, that leather would swell. And if you didn't vent the top of it, the leather would burst. And what he's saying here is, I feel like I'm about to explode because I have an opinion, and I've been sitting here for 30-something, about 29 or 30 chapters, listening to you guys talk, and I've got an opinion I want to express, and I feel like if I don't, I'm going to explode. And every single one of us in this room this morning have been there before. We've all been at some point where we had an opinion, and we were dying to tell somebody, and we felt like if we didn't, we were going to explode. And that's what he admits. That's how he feels right now. Okay, let's continue reading. I was in verse 19. Behold, my belly is as wine which hath no vent. It is ready to burst like new bottles. I will speak that I may be refreshed. I will open my lips and answer. So Elihu is admitting, I'm about to give you my opinion, because when I do, I will feel better. And again, every one of us in this room this morning have been there before. In fact, Ray Young has been there too many times. There's been too many times when I had an opinion that I was dying to give, but usually because I was angry about something. And I was just, and I was wanting to let it out, because I knew when I let it out, I'd feel better. But the problem is, those who heard what I said while I was angry, now usually they don't feel better. And Elihu's admitting that he's going to give his opinion regardless of what it does to you, because it'll make me feel better. And my point is this. Every one of us have opinions about everything. I think I told you this before. I was in my house one day, upstairs, working with a repairman, and I went over to the top of the stairs, and I leaned down, and I said to my wife, Debbie, do you want to come up here and give us your opinion about? And she said, yes. And I said, what do you mean, yes? You don't even know what it's about yet. She said, it doesn't matter what it's about. I want to give you my opinion. And we're all that way. But there are some times when we don't want to just give our opinion. We're hoping somebody will respect our opinion. And that's what Elihu wanted. He wanted these older men to respect his opinion. So I told you before, and I'm done with the review when I make this statement. I told you before that for about 6 months, I took one morning per week, and then the staff and faculty meeting at the college, I taught the staff and faculty what the Bible teaches, or some of what the Bible teaches, about how you can get people to respect your opinion. You may remember that that 2 out of the last 4 years I was here, I taught you, I think it was about 4 of those lessons that I taught the staff and faculty. The first one, and I'm not going to reteach these this morning. I'm not going to go back through all the many, many verses that we used before, but I'm just going to remind you. The first lesson I taught the staff and faculty, and I presented it here also, is this truth, The Bible teaches that if you want people to respect your opinion, don't give it very often. And I admitted that's the one of the 26 lessons I taught that the staff and faculty liked the least. And then number two, if you want people to respect your opinion, then limit most of your opinions to your own areas of responsibility. Number three, if you want people to respect your opinion, give more positive opinions than you do negative opinions. And then number four, I said it's usually best to only give your opinion when you're asked for it. Notice I said usually, that's not always the case. All right, now this morning, if you would, turn to the book of Proverbs chapter 18. The book of Proverbs chapter 18. And let's look and see here what God has to say about our opinion and our expressing that opinion to others. I'm in the book of Proverbs. I'm at chapter 18, and I'm going to begin with verse 13. Proverbs 18:13 says, "He that answereth a matter before he heareth it, it is a folly and a shame unto him." Would you look at me just for a minute? How many times has Ray Young heard one little statement about some big issue, and before the person could put a period at the end of their sentence, I had an opinion formulated, and I was already beginning to express that opinion based on one little statement that I heard. Now, I wasn't there when it happened, but I have an opinion. I never met anybody that was involved in this situation, but I have an opinion. One of my favorite stories I got from a book that I read years ago. You remember here in our nation, we had two different presidents in the last generation or so by the name of Bush. The father, George Bush, and then years later, a few years later, the son, George Bush. Now, he's not George Bush Jr., but I always get their initials mixed up, so I call them George Bush Sr. and George Bush Jr., even though that's not accurate, but at least you know who I'm talking about. When George Bush Jr. became the president, at the end of his presidency, he wrote his memoirs like most presidents do. And I remember the day it came out, I was standing at the store waiting for him to open up because I wanted the book and I wanted to read it. And I remember reading in that book something that he said. George Bush Jr. said that after he had been president for about 3 or 4 months, some big issue came up. And he felt like he needed some advice. Well, who in the world would be better to get advice from than your own father? Plus, your own father who used to do the very job that you're now doing. Man, that sounds like the smartest thing in the whole world to go get advice from your own dad in that situation. So George Bush Jr. calls George Bush Sr. and he says, "Dad, I'm dealing with," and he tells him a little bit about it, and he says, "I want your opinion." And George Bush Sr. says, "When you let every one of your cabinet members tell me every single thing they know about this issue, and when you show me your morning reports," are you aware that every one of our presidents get what they call morning reports? It's a brief summary of every issue that has taken place, significant issue that has taken place around the world in the last 24 hours. Every president gets those reports every single morning. And George Bush Sr. said to George Bush Jr., "When you let every one of your cabinet members tell me every single thing they know about this issue, and when you show me your morning reports for a month, then I'll give you my opinion." He said, "Until then, I don't have an opinion." But how many times has Ray Young heard somebody make one statement, and the next words out of my mouth were, and I'm confessing my sin to you this morning, "Yeah, and I'll tell you why he did that." Hey, don't leave me up here on an island all by myself. You ever been there? You ever done that? Every one of us have. But the Bible says it is a folly, means foolishness, and a shame when I answer a matter that I haven't even heard yet. So my point is this. If you want people to respect your opinion, don't give your opinion until you know all the facts. All right, now if you would, look at verse 14. I'm still in Proverbs chapter 18, and we read verse 13. Verse 13 said, He that answereth a matter before he heareth it, it is a folly and a shame unto him. Would you look at me just for a second before we read? There are some proverbs in the book of Proverbs that stand alone. That one proverb just says what it says, and then you move on to the next proverb. But there are certain proverbs in the book of Proverbs that are in order on purpose because they relate to each other. And my opinion is, here I am giving my opinion, my opinion is this is one of those examples. Verse 13 and verse 14 sort of relate to each other. All right? Look again. Verse 13 says, He that answereth a matter before he heareth it, it is a folly and a shame unto him. The spirit of a man will sustain his infirmity. All right, would you look at me just for a moment? The spirit of a man will sustain his infirmity. Have you ever heard of a doctor making this statement? We've done all we can do. I'm sorry, there's nothing else we can do. It's just a matter of time until they will expire. And then, weeks or months later, that same doctor says, all I can tell you is he had the will to live. He wasn't ready to die. He had the will to live. Or you ever heard this statement? You ever heard of a doctor making this statement? Medically speaking, I can't tell you what's wrong with him, but he has lost his will to live. I've heard many times of doctors making statements like that. What they're saying is, and what that verse is saying, is sometimes a man's spirit will do more to keep his body alive than his physical body can do to keep itself alive. The man that was the president of our college for 26 years, his name was Wendell Evans. He just went to heaven about 6 weeks ago. Wendell Evans was married twice. When his first wife, he and his first wife were married, her name was Marlene. Marlene Evans was a big personality, and everybody loved her, and just a wonderful person. But she had cancer. And I'll be honest with you, I don't remember the name of the cancer. But I remember they said about this particular cancer that less than 20% of the people who get this particular cancer ever live through it. And then they said, and if that cancer comes back a second time, less than 3% of the people live as much as 6 months. And no one in medical history has ever lived more than a year with this type of cancer reoccurring a second time. She got the cancer. They diagnosed it. They treated her with chemo and so forth for just a few months. But 15 years later, Mayo Clinic. You ever heard of Mayo Clinic? The most renowned medical facility probably in the world, up in Rochester, Minnesota. Mayo Clinic called Marlene Evans on the phone and said, we would like to pay all of your expenses for you to come back to Rochester, Minnesota, because we want a panel of our doctors, the most renowned medical facility in the world. We want a panel of our doctors to be able to interview you about what you did to survive this cancer a second time. And she said, well, All I can tell you is this. Every Sunday I go to church, and in one way or another, my pastor tells me, you can live one more week. She said, somehow, through God's help, through my pastor's message, whatever he's preaching on that particular Sunday, it says to me, you can live one more week. She had tried to give up. When they diagnosed her the second time with that cancer, she was at Mayo Clinic. She was in a hotel room with her assistant, Carol Fry was her name back then. You remember her? And she had told Carol, I'm not going through this again. That chemotherapy, it makes me crazy, and I'm not going through that again. I'm just going to give up. That was like 14 years ago when she did that. Carol Fry called Brother Hiles and said, I'm in the certain hotel in Rochester, Minnesota, and Mrs. Evans has just been diagnosed with the same cancer a second time. They give her less than a 3% chance to live 6 months. She has given up. She doesn't want to take chemotherapy. And Brother Hiles said, put her on the phone. And Brother Hiles said, Marlene, I hear you're not going to try to survive this time. She said, Brother Hiles, I don't want to go through that chemotherapy. She said, it makes me crazy. He said, Marlene, I've known you for years. That chemotherapy has nothing to do with how crazy you are. And he got her laughing. And 15 years later, she said, all I know is I go to church every Sunday. And the Spirit of God, through my pastor's preaching, tells me you can live one more week. I find it pretty interesting that almost to the day, 6 months after Brother Hiles went to heaven, Marlene Evans went to heaven. The spirit of a man can sustain his infirmities. That's what the first half of that verse is saying. Now let's see what God compares that to. Verse 14. The spirit of a man will sustain his infirmity. That's a pretty powerful statement. But a wounded spirit who can bear? You know what God is saying there? God is saying, as powerful as your spirit is to give life to your body when your body doesn't have the strength to maintain its own life, he said just that powerful is when somebody wounds someone's spirit that can cause death. I wonder how many times Ray Young has wounded the spirit of some wife because of something I said about her husband when I didn't know the facts. I gave my uneducated opinion about who he was and what he was doing, and better yet, why he was doing it. God said we don't even know our own heart. How in the world do we propose to know somebody else's heart? But I have been there more times than I should have been. How many times have I given my opinion about why somebody did something, but I didn't know the facts, and his wife did, and I wounded her spirit. And I know what we all want to say. We want to say, well, because you say, how do you know we want to say that? Because I've said it before. We all want to say, well, I'm big enough to admit when I'm wrong. If I find out later that what I said wasn't right, I'll apologize. But you know, sometimes it's too late. Look at verse 21. I'm still in Proverbs chapter 18, verse 21. Look at verse 21. Verse 21 says, death and life are in the power of the tongue, and he that loveth it shall eat the fruit thereof. That first statement, death and life are in the power of the tongue. You know, there have been people who literally lived because somebody told them they could. And there have literally been people who have died because somebody told them they should, or they would, or they were going to. Years ago, there was a family in our church by the name of Stromberg. They had a daughter by the name of Sharon. Sharon was in the car one afternoon coming home from school with 5 other teenagers from our church. They were going north on Route 41, just a little ways from our high school there. And some of you know where that big bridge goes over the railroad tracks just north of Walmart there. Back then, it used to be a metal bridge. Now it's an asphalt concrete bridge, but it used to be a metal bridge. And they were going home from school, and a man was coming the other direction, and he lost control of his vehicle and veered across the center line on some ice, and he hit him head on. And one of the teenagers in the car was killed, and a couple of the others injured. And Sharon Stromberg had so many injuries that the doctors said, there's nothing we can do. We're not even going to set her bones. She had about a dozen broken bones. They said, we're not even going to set her bones. We're just going to clean her up. We're going to give her some pain medicine, and she won't be here very long. She was in a coma. Brother Howes heard about it. He jumped in his car, and he rushed up to the Mercy Dyer Hospital in Dyer, Indiana, just a little ways from our church. And he went in the room where Sharon was lying there in a coma, and he got down and he whispered in her ear. And he said, Sharon, this is Brother Howes. The doctor said you can't live. But Sharon, I don't believe that. Sharon, this is Brother Howes, and I'm here to tell you that you can live. Sharon, if you'll keep breathing, you can live. And he whispered in her ear about a dozen times, you can do it, Sharon. You can do it. Keep breathing. You can do it. He went back to his office. The next day he came back. She was still breathing. He got down in her ear and he whispered, Sharon, this is Brother Howes. I told you that if you'd keep breathing, you could live. Sharon, I don't know how much you're aware of because you're in a coma, but if you can hear me, I want you to know that you've been alive now for about 24 hours. And if you'll keep breathing, you can live, Sharon. 24 hours later, he came back. He did it again. 24 hours later. He did it about 5 or 6 days in a row. He had to leave and go out of town to preach in a meeting. And he said, Sharon, I'm leaving to go out of town. I'll be back in 3 days. You keep breathing till I get back. And every day he was in town for about 5 weeks, he went out and whispered in her ear, you can do it, Sharon. You can do it. About 6 months later, Sharon came to church on a Sunday morning for the first time. They pushed her in a wheelchair. She was sitting in the back in a wheelchair. They were about to take the offering, and Brother Howes was standing in the pulpit, and when the usher came down with the offering plate, he had a note in his hand, and he handed it to Brother Howes. And it said, Dear Brother Howes, I did, Sharon. But our wounds that we give are just that powerful. And there have been times that I'm afraid I've wounded people because I had an opinion that I was just dying to give, mainly because I was angry. Now, you would have to have grown up in the culture I grew up in to understand what I'm about to say. But I grew up in Louisiana. In Louisiana, there was a time for many, many years, in fact, the whole time I was growing up, our state motto was Sportsman's Paradise. It was on our license plate, on the back of the car, Louisiana, Sportsman's Paradise. That was officially on the Louisiana car license plates. And hunting and fishing, that's just all life was. It wasn't that hunting and fishing was the only thing was the biggest thing in life. It was the only thing in life. Hunting and fishing was just, that's what everybody in Louisiana, I remember one time we got a new football coach. His name was Coach Burton. He was the head coach for our team. He had played for the Los Angeles Rams, and he retired from that, and he came down to Louisiana and became our coach. In one of the first games of the season, we lost 33-0. And on the bus on the way back to the school that Friday night, he got up and said, fellas, I'm not coaching this kind of team. He said, we're not going to have this kind of season. He said, we're going to fix this. And he said, in fact, we're not waiting till Monday to start working on it. We're going to start tomorrow morning. I'm calling a special practice tomorrow morning. We're going to fix this. Saturday morning, one boy showed up for football practice. What Coach Burton didn't know was it was opening day of duck season in Louisiana. And he didn't have any idea what culture he was in. But growing up in that culture, I left there and went up north, married my wife. I was living in Indiana. I'd been up there a few years. We went home for Thanksgiving. When we got home for Thanksgiving, we went by my parents' house. I dropped her off, her and the kids. I dropped them off. And then I drove out in the country to my brother's house. When I drove up in his front yard, he's standing in the front yard with a deer hanging in a tree. He's skinning it. My dad and my other brother were standing there watching him. The three of them were talking. I walk up. I start talking to him. Real nice deer, probably the best one he's ever killed. We're all excited for him. And about that time, a car drives up, pulls off the side of the road. A man gets out. I recognize him. He's the man who used to drive my bus. When I was a teenager, I was a bus captain, and he was my bus driver. Man, I was glad to see him. I went over to him. I put my hand out. He just walked right past me. Never said a word to me, never shook my hand. I thought, my goodness, what in the world? He walks up to my brother skinning that deer, and he begins to ask some pretty pointed questions. Who killed this deer? Where was it killed? Whose property were you on? Who gave you permission to hunt on it? And that conversation got real tense real quick. And you know, my father, he was a gun safety addict. I mean, that was the big, he had 3 boys in his home, no girls, and he was big on gun safety. You never take your gun off safety till you're ready to kill something, and the first thing you do when you pick a gun up, you check the safety. The last thing you do before you hand it to somebody, you check the safety. And in the middle of this heated conversation, and he taught us, when you take your gun off safety, you do it real easy so it doesn't make that big loud metal click, you know, to scare the game off. And in the middle of this heated conversation, all of a sudden, I hear my dad's .30-06 click. And the conversation calmed down real fast. And Mr. So-and-so, won't say his name, got in his car and left. And I couldn't wait. I said, Dad, why in the world did you take your gun off safety? He said, your brother couldn't see it, but Mr. So-and-so was standing next to your brother here, and Mr. So-and-so had reached down and unsnapped his hunting knife. And I said, well, why did you click it so loud? He said, because I wanted him to know it was off safety. Now here's the question. Was my dad hoping to get to use the power of life and death that he was holding in his hand with that .30-06? No. He was hoping not to have to use it. He was doing everything in his power to not use it. But how many times have I been so anxious to use the power of life and death that I couldn't wait to just click it off safety and let it rattle the moment I got my chance. Because I knew when I did, I'd feel better, regardless of how it made you feel. If you want people to respect your opinion, wait until you have all the facts before you give your opinion. Thank you. I think we're finished about 3 minutes early this morning, so if I go 3 minutes over in the next hour,